Good afternoon, I'm Janine Grespan. We're going to take a look back at the major events in this province in 1993, a year of triumphs and tragedies. We'll hear from a provincial MP about the red tide that swept Ontario in this year's federal election. A former American president visited southern Ontario and joined a construction team in the name of humanity. Kitchener put up a new city hall, and Windsor is preparing for casino gambling. And this year's biggest story, the manslaughter trial of Carla Teal in the deaths of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. A publication ban has sparked raging debate about the public's right to know the details of her trial and conviction. These stories and more as CKCO-TV reviews the year that was 1993. 1993 was the year of one of the most sensational murder trials in Canadian history. A frustrating investigation for police broke open in January when a 23-year-old veterinary assistant named Carla Teal complained that her husband Paul beat her with a flashlight. After listening to her story, police charged Carla and Paul Teal in the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. The full story won't be known until after Paul Teal's trial, and the government has been fighting a losing battle to keep details from Carla Teal's trial secret. Franklin reports.
Nearly 200 people lined up outside the St. Catharines courtroom hoping to get a seat inside for Carla Teal's trial.
Because I want to find out the truth.
I think you should have the trial done at the arena so that the whole public can get in.
Not everyone wants to know what happened to 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey. Police found her body parts encased in concrete dumped in a lake. Or what happened to 15-year-old Kristen French before she was murdered. Her body was dumped in a ditch near Burlington. Media lawyers at Carla Teal's trial argued the case against Carla should be made public because people have the right to know.
The best way of getting accurate information to the public is to allow prompt publication of the facts. And then the community will actually get real information instead of misinformation.
Paul Teal's lawyer wanted details of the charges against Carla made public. He believes he raised some doubts about the image of Carla Teal he says the police created, an image of Carla as an innocent victim of Paul Teal.
I hope that it's clear to the public that maybe the way the case has been portrayed in the media to the present does not represent the whole story.
In the end, Justice Francis Kovacs kept the public out of the trial, and he ordered the news media to keep the details secret until after Paul Teal's trial. That, said Justice Kovacs, would ensure that Paul Teal would get a fair trial. Carla Teal was given a 12-year prison term for manslaughter. Paul Teal remains in jail awaiting trial on first-degree murder charges in this case and 50 other charges of rape. His trial is at least a year away.
The story of Paul and Carla Teal came to us through an anonymous phone call.
First, American TV programs started chipping away at the publication ban. Then British and U.S. newspapers printed details.
Typed in its number.
Anyone in Canada with certain computer information services could read information said to be from the trial. By November, the ban was falling apart.
Okay.
This retired police officer, Gordon Daum, was arrested in Guelph for trying to distribute a U.S. newspaper story on the Teals. A week later, he succeeded in mailing another U.S. newspaper story, and Gordon Daum became the first person charged with a criminal offense for defying the ban. By year end, even an Israeli newspaper that's distributed in Canada carried some details of Carla Teal's trial. The challenges against the publication ban continue. Rogers Cable TV wants the publication ban lifted. Rogers says its customers are furious. Each time a U.S. program deals with the Teal's story, Rogers and other Canadian cable companies are required to change the signal, giving their viewers something else. And all the lawyers who fought against the ban at Carla Teal's trial, including Paul Teal's lawyer, will be back in court trying to have the publication ban lifted. Janine.
Frank, what arguments are the lawyers going to use this time?
Well, the media company lawyers will argue that the ban isn't working anyway because the court can't control information traveling electronically across international borders, so it should be lifted. Others will argue that since Paul Teal wanted Carla's trial public in the first place, his rights were ignored when the publication ban was imposed. And lawyers will argue there's no evidence to show that releasing information from Carla's trial would make it impossible to find an impartial jury for Paul Teal's trial. Government lawyers will say the media has no right to appeal a ban like this one, and the court shouldn't even consider their arguments.
All right, Frank, when is all this going to take place?
Janine, 3 days of court time has been set aside for the end of this month for those arguments.
Thanks for this, Frank.
You're welcome, Janine.
In May, the man who gunned down 3 people at Ontario Glove was sentenced to life in prison. Armed with a hunting rifle, Patrick Dombrowski walked into the Waterloo Company on February 3, 1992. In a cold-blooded crime, he shot Greg Moore, Larry Strack, and Elizabeth Travassos because they were responsible for his suspension from work. Dombrowski's lawyers argued he wasn't criminally responsible for his actions because of a mental disorder. The jury disagreed and found Dombrowski guilty of first-degree murder on all 3 counts. A brutal murder to begin 1993. A University of Waterloo student was beaten to death. 34-year-old David Saharchuk was killed New Year's Day. He was hit on the head with a heavy wrench 9 times. In December, Chris Workington, a third-year engineering student at the university, pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Court was told Workington went on a drunken rampage at the university, smashing glass and computers. When confronted by Saharchuk, Workington beat him to death. Workington is serving a 10-year prison sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in 3 years. Murder struck the city of Barrie in early October. It was the worst weekend for crime in that city this year. First, a cab driver was found killed in his car. Then 2 days later, police made a grisly discovery in a quiet residential neighborhood. Vicki Goff reports on the triple homicide investigation of 3 people found stabbed in a house in the city's north end.
Disbelief gripped the city of Barrie in early October when police stumbled on the city's worst crime of the year. A police officer following up on a missing person report found 3 people bound and stabbed in this North End house.
2 of the victims were bound hand and foot, and 1 victim did have a scarf around the neck. It appears to the investigators that robbery was the motive for this crime.
The homeowner was one of those victims. 85-year-old Ellsworth Beers was a much-loved and respected man.
And I'm so saddened because for the life that man led, I know his wife was ill for a long time, and he used to go into the hospital every day and feed her because she was not able to feed herself. Very kind, giving man.
Yes, oh yeah, he was a real outgoing person. Fine gentleman.
Beers' granddaughter, 22-year-old Pamela Constable, and a family friend, 28-year-old Scott Seabrook, were also murdered. Police went on an exhaustive search for clues. By night, forensic experts used special ultraviolet technology to record their findings inside the house. By day, the interior search for evidence continued as investigators videotaped the exterior of the property. A command post set up across the street remained for more than a week. Despite all these efforts, however, police had no suspects, and it wasn't their only homicide investigation at the time. Just a couple of days earlier, a Barrie cab driver was found murdered in his car.
Well, you've got to understand that we have a small police force, and we've got 2 major investigations underway, plus the daily investigations that we do. And we are stretched to the max right now.
For residents watching the story unfold in their neighborhood, fear soon turned to anger. People continued to insist that Barrie was no more dangerous than anywhere else.
It happens everywhere, you know, but I got mad yesterday, though, because they say it was just like Toronto, and Barrie isn't like Toronto.
The police investigation continues. In Barrie, Vicki Goff, CKCO-TV News.
A Montreal man was sentenced to life in prison on November 15th for beating and sexually assaulting a woman from Gravenhurst. Philippe Clement pleaded guilty to 7 charges, including attempted murder and aggravated sexual assault. The 34-year-old was serving time at Beaver Creek Correctional Institute in September of 1992 when he escaped. Before he was captured 2 days later, a woman was badly beaten and raped in her home. Clement received 2 concurrent life sentences with no chance of parole for 10 years on the more serious charges. Last summer, a Chatham police officer was convicted of manslaughter. Ron Tricker was charged in connection with the death of 37-year-old John Ryu of Chatham. Ryu was clocked speeding near his home in March of 1992. He died a short time later following a struggle with Tricker at his home. Tricker was sentenced to 3 years in penitentiary. His lawyer has launched an appeal, and in the meantime, Tricker is out of custody and working a desk shift at the Chatham Police Department. On November 17th, 2 men were found guilty of killing 40-year-old Douglas Grass. Grass was killed in February in his downtown Stratford home. He'd been beaten to death with a hammer. Grass was a props maker at the Stratford Festival. 47-year-old David Maltby pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and 22-year-old Robert Gaunt pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The London OPP Crime Unit continued work on a series of highway shootings in 1993. A dozen transport trucks traveling on 400 series highways have been shot at from highway overpasses, and whoever is doing the shooting remains at large. In the fall, police released a photo of a pickup truck that may be associated with the shootings. The photo brought in dozens of tips, but nothing that singled out a suspect. So far, there have been no serious injuries as a result of the sniper attacks. There were renewed calls in 1993 for median barriers along parts of the Conestoga Expressway in Kitchener. There have been 7 crossover accidents on the expressway since May of 1990. In June, 3 people, including 2 teenagers, were killed when the car the teens were driving shot across the median. And there was a spectacular 5-vehicle crossover accident in November. Miraculously, no one was killed. Motorists and politicians called on Queen's Park to erect concrete barriers. The Ministry of Transport promised the barriers for the fall. "1993 was the year that Kitchener declared war on crack cocaine. The drug first appeared in the city in the late 80s, but in recent years, crack use has become much more widespread. As Chris Duncan reports, police, politicians, and entire neighborhoods have joined forces to battle the problem.
This man is smoking a rock of crack cocaine, and we're along for the ride.
Feeling very good. Very good.
Describe the feeling for me.
Whatever you got hurt anywhere, you're feeling everything done. It's good now.
It's a rare glimpse of the drug and one of the many people who have become addicted to it. Experts say crack is deadly because the high is intense but short-lived.
You can only stay that way for about 10 minutes at a time. And that means that the user is going to want more of it very quickly. So it sets up this pattern of using it over and over and over again.
Here in the downtown core, it seemed like no street was immune to the problem. This street was notorious for its crack houses and prostitution. Now it's an example of what can happen when a neighborhood fights back.
These buildings used to be crack houses. Now they're the home of the local AIDS committee and an art gallery. The people who live in this area get much of the credit for chasing the dealers away. They spend many cold nights patrolling the streets, making life difficult for the dealers, the users, and the hookers.
We've got the license numbers. We've got a computer list that we've made up as a group and turned over to the police, and it's astounding the number of people that come here to get this horrible drug.
But the people don't come here as often anymore. The head of the region's drug unit claims there are fewer dealers.
Many have been sent to jail, and when they are released, they've chosen to move to other communities. So we do see new faces all the time, people to take their place. We've become better equipped to deal with crack houses and with crack dealers, and that's why we don't see the number of crack houses we did. In fact, there are very few today.
There may be fewer crack houses, but use of the drug hasn't diminished. This large amount of cocaine was recently seized by the RCMP. Police admit they've driven the problem underground, but they can't stop it. In Kitchener, Chris Duncan, CKCO-TV News.
It's been 2.5 years since 2 women started talking about physical and sexual abuse at an old Cambridge reform school. Since then, the story has taken a number of twists and turns. Even a former Ontario cabinet minister has been charged by police in this affair. Art Beaumont brings us up to date on that case and takes a look back at a place called Grandview.
Grandview closed in 1976. When it first opened, it was heralded as a breakthrough in corrections for girls between 10 and 18, a progressive approach in dealing with troubled youth. But in the spring of '91, the image began to change when 2 women from Niagara told police about sexual abuse at the school by male guards. The investigation had begun.
What we've done is we've assigned a team of detectives. That team of detectives is in fact working closely with the Crown Attorney's Office.
Police and the Crown also talked with dozens of other former Grandview residents who also came forward with similar stories of sexual abuse. The women formed a group supporting each other and protesting the government for quick action in their cases. And then came a bombshell. A member of the government was charged by police. Former Cabinet Minister Will Ferguson was charged with sexual intercourse, breach of trust, and assisting to escape. Ferguson worked at Grandview in the early 70s. His trial begins April 5th, and he's confident he'll prove his innocence.
You know, it's easy for one to get down, but let me tell you, I did absolutely nothing wrong 20 years ago, and I'm going to, I think, prove that beyond anybody's doubt.
Meanwhile, a former psychologist at Grandview is also facing charges. Dr. Robert Ross, on the left, faces 21 counts, including rape, gross indecency, and breach of trust. His preliminary hearing is scheduled to begin in mid-February. Back in the summer of 1991, police expected to wrap up their investigation in a few months, maybe a little longer. But now, almost 3 years after 2 women came forward, the work on the Grandview case continues. In the words of one Crown attorney, witnesses and new information keeps filtering in. In Kitchener, Art Beaumont, CKCO-TV News.
A London teacher of the deaf went to jail in November of 1993. 46-year-old Gerald Hall was convicted on sex charges for making advances on several teenage deaf students. He will serve a 4-year prison term. Hall's lawyer is planning to appeal both the conviction and the sentence. In the meantime, Gerald Hall is spending his days behind the walls of Warkworth Penitentiary. A child pornography ring was broken by London police in November. Acting on a tip, police seized 220 pornographic videotapes from 2 downtown London residences. More than 20 young boys are seen on those tapes. Police have laid sex charges against 5 people so far, including an elementary school principal. More charges are expected. On December 8th, all charges against Randy Jorgensen were dropped. Jorgensen is the owner of the adults-only video stores. His business is based in Kitchener. Police raided 22 of his stores across Ontario, seizing copies of 10 erotic movies. They charged Jorgensen for selling the hardcore sex films. He says the whole controversy started because the Ontario Film Review Board approved the videos. Then the OPP's anti-pornography squad took them and called them obscene. But he was pleased with the court's ruling. In 1993, Canadian voters saw red. Anger over the Tory regime forced a dramatic reversal of power. As the polls closed October 25th, the Liberal landslide moved in. Kitchener MP John English, one of the many newcomers to Parliament Hill, spoke with CKCO's Lisa Laflamme about this year and next.
And in January 93, I thought that things looked pretty good for the Liberals. Mr. Mulrooney was still in office. He was still terribly, terribly unpopular.
And Jean Chrétien was riding a wave of popularity that in October would take his party to Parliament, and with it a lot of first-time MPs like John English. Voters across the province were definitely looking for change. It came in Liberal red, except in Simcoe Centre. Reform's Ed Harper won that riding, but the party did come in second in most others.
Makes any politician have to look behind you to make sure that you've got people following you. And the Reform Party made a very strong and fairly successful appeal to people who felt alienated from the system. So you have to look at your constituency, you have to look at people in your constituency, obviously, to make certain that they feel more represented.
Now all Liberal representatives are looking for public input to improve the perception of politics.
If you are a politician in Canada, you have to be aware that sudden death can occur fairly soon.
And it did for Kim Campbell and the Progressive Conservatives, gaining only 2 seats nationally, forcing a lot of veteran politicians out of office and a lot of newcomers into the hot seat.
And seldom have we faced, or never have we faced, quite the scale of economic crisis that we're going to face probably in 1994. The size of the yearly deficit is the largest we've had outside of wartime. The problem has to be dealt with, and we're going to have to make some very hard choices that will affect my community.
MP John English will also have the difficult task of explaining those choices to this community and making next year's fiscal decisions as painless as possible. In Kitchener, Lisa Laflamme, CKCO-TV News.
If your salary is paid for with Ontario tax dollars, you are well aware of the single most important issue out of Queen's Park in 1993. It's the social contract, a law which means you and 950,000 other public sector workers now earn less money and have to take days off without pay. Ray Days. Bob Ray says the law saved 40,000 jobs and helped keep the provincial deficit under $10 billion. But as CKCO's Guy Lepage reports, it also resulted in a divorce between his government and Labour.
We voted to win and we are sorry! We are sorry! You're no better than a Tory! You're no better than a Tory!
To its dismay, Labour quickly realized this year that Bob Ray's NDP government in 1993 was not the one they voted for in 1990. They never expected the NDP would impose a law which reopened their collective agreements and imposed wage rollbacks and days off without pay.
Hello again.
Labour and public sector employees found out in April how bad the pain would be. In the first meeting of its kind ever, representatives from every union and agency which receives government funding was told they must collectively come up with $2 billion in cuts.
But I was very encouraged by the reaction this morning. I thought it was very, very constructive.
Judging from initial union reaction, one had to wonder if Ray was at the same meeting.
And it simply lacks leadership and it lacks creativity.
This is about job cuts and concessions. And it's to call it a social contract is a misnomer.
What followed were months of false starts, grandstanding, and ultimately futile negotiations.
It's a scam. The con continues.
We reject the fact that the outcomes are already determined and that the only choices we have are about what brand of poison we have to swallow.
In the end, choosing a poison was something a coalition representing 28 unions decided it did not want to do, and it walked out of the talks. So in June, the government passed a law which imposed the $2 billion cuts. The relationship between Labour and the NDP deteriorated even further.
I think they're just marching this party into political oblivion.
In November, Labour fought back by turning its back on the Ray government. At its annual convention, the Ontario Federation of Labour and its member groups withdrew its financial support from Bob Ray's NDP. Not only does the decision bring a loss of dollars, but also a withdrawal of the army of supporters who put Bob Ray into office in the first place. But even that didn't shake the Premier's belief that the social contract is necessary because it saved 40,000 jobs.
Say it again, I really believe it. Better to have a Ray Day than not to have any days of work at all.
At Queen's Park, Guy Lepage, CKCO-TV News.
500 secondary school teachers in Sarnia and Lambton County went on strike on September 14th. The strike forced the closure of 7 high schools, barring 6,000 students from the classroom. The strike came about after more than a year of negotiations failed to produce a new contract. Lambton school trustees were reluctant to grant a teacher demand that a staffing formula be included in a new agreement. Teachers had worked all of the 92-93 school year under a contract that had expired in August of 1992. During September and October, parents organized marches and rallies in a bid to get trustees with the board and teachers back to the table. On October 26th, acting on a recommendation, Ontario Education Minister Dave Cook ordered the teachers back to work. It ended a walkout that wiped out 30 school days. In early November, history began to repeat itself as work on a second rail tunnel under the St. Clair River got underway in Sarnia. It was just over 100 years ago that the first St. Clair Tunnel opened. The tunnel has been a conduit for passengers and goods between the U.S. and Canada for more than a century. In recent years, though, its usefulness has declined, mainly due to its size.
plans were approved for a bigger, more modern tunnel, one that could accommodate double-stacked container cars. On November 1st, a specially built multi-million-dollar boring machine began digging its way to Port Huron, Michigan. It's excavating about 8 meters of clay and gravel a day, a few meters north of the original tunnel. The tunnel should be completed by late 1994.
One of the more festive events of 1993 was the week-long celebration of the opening of Kitchener's new City Hall back in September. CKCO's Jim Alexander has a look at that event and the hall itself, 3 months after the big party.
It's only a short walk from the mayor's office to the front of the building that now serves as a focal point for King Street and the entire downtown. And for Dom Cardillo, a noon-hour skate on a mild December day comes just as easily as settling into the new Kitchener City Hall, completed last summer at a cost of almost $66 million. It was a plan designed to return City Hall to a place of civic prominence.
Very much so. To get it back in a focal point, and we've achieved that with the accessibility that it has, and of course the location, a former city block bounded by King, as you say, Yonge and College and Duke, and certainly any entrance that you come in gives you that awesome feeling, but yet very, very friendly, and of course that's what it's all about, a civic building that belongs to the taxpayers of the city of Kitchener.
After 30 years in politics, negotiating the ice surface is a lot easier than taking the dream of a civic-owned building from paper to reality. Construction that began back in 1991 was finished off by the small army of construction workers that waged a race against the clock to get things ready for the party that would launch Kitchener into the 21st century of municipal government.
3, 2, 1, and bingo.
It turned into a week-long celebration, and it's still very much on the mind of Don Spencer, a McGarry Drive resident who had outdueled a host of participants in a City Hall speech contest. After making a few more visits to the City Hall he helped open, he feels some good things are happening downtown.
But you go down, like you say, 3 months later, you look around and see who's there, what people are doing, are more families downtown. And I think we're beginning to see a change. It's safe to walk 2 or 3 blocks in the downtown area now, and to go with your young children and to spend an evening on the pond doing some skating, that's quite a change for the downtown core.
And change is what this building is all about. A change in the way the city presents and feels about itself. A change that's remembered as one of the highlights of 1993. In Kitchener, Jim Alexander, CKCO-TV News.
1993 was the year of the pseudo-recovery. Most economists and government officials spent the year trying to convince Canadians that the recession was over. But as Brent Hansen explains, the recovery wasn't apparent in stores or the employment office either.
For most of us, the effects of the recession lingered on through 1993. Consumers stayed out of stores, but employment offices were full. But is it a jobless recovery? Economists can't agree.
It's been referred to as a jobless recovery. That's not technically correct. There has been job creation during this recovery. Not nearly as much as in past recoveries, but...
A change of government did nothing to help, and Prime Minister Jean Chrétien soon found himself backtracking on his main election promise of job creation. He did cancel the helicopter deal, but okayed free trade. The deficit situation went from bad to worse, as Finance Minister Paul Martin calculated it could now be $46 billion. The federal government asked for help from the business community to get the black market under control by turning in cheaters.
I intend to enforce the law quite hard.
The only consistently bright spot for the economy has been trade. The lower Canadian dollar has made our manufactured products more attractive south of the border, and that spurred our auto parts plants. As 1993 drew to a close, laid-off workers were being called back with promises of more hiring in the new year.
But if you looked at 1993 in the overall context, you would see it was more bust than boom. One of the biggest obstacles to a sustained recovery, higher taxes, continued to erode away consumer confidence and spending power. So with problems of the deficit and how to get it under control spilling over into the new year, it gives every indication that 94 will be a lot like 93.
Brent Hansen, CKCO-TV News.
Chrysler employees ratified a new 3-year deal late in the summer that gave them a 4.5% wage hike in each year of the agreement. The agreement forced Chrysler to begin a third shift at its Windsor minivan plant. Production from the third shift should be at full capacity within a few months, creating jobs for close to 1,000 people and producing 1,500 vans a day. Other automakers have been chipping away at Chrysler's share of the minivan market over the past decade, but Chrysler officials predict a steady demand will provide stable jobs for the new employees. Windsorites spent the year preparing for what will be Ontario's very first casino. Windsor's art gallery is being converted into a temporary casino right now. It should open for business by April. A permanent gaming house will be built just a few blocks away, facing the Detroit River. It will be operated by a company called Windsor Casino Limited, which is owned jointly by casino giants Circus, Hilton Hotels, and Caesars World Incorporated. The permanent facility is expected to gross $450 million in its first year and should create 12,000 direct and indirect jobs. September this year saw thousands of people traveling to Bruce County, the site of the annual plowing match and farm machinery show. More than 350 volunteers spent 3 years preparing for the show, which was held on the Johnston Farm outside of Walkerton. About 150,000 people toured the 10 kilometers of roadway in the tented city, which housed more than 600 exhibitors. There was also a variety of plowing events and farm machinery demonstrations during the week-long event.
In early May of 1993, there was a news event that continues to this day. A group of Stony Point natives entered the military base at Camp Ipperwash in a bid to reclaim the land they say is theirs. Rick Smith updates the story from Sarnia.
On May 6th, a handful of First Nations people entered Camp Ipperwash to protest delays by the Department of National Defense in returning their land as had been promised. The federal government appropriated the land in 1942 under the War Measures Act and set up a training base. Native residents were moved to the nearby Kettle Point Reserve. Over the years, descendants of the First Nations occupants have staged periodic sit-ins and gate picketing demanding the land be returned. But when they entered the camp in May, they came home to stay.
Well, we're taking possession of our lands. Our people are the old elderly people, and they want to come home now, so we're here to take possession.
About 50 people moved on to the camp. They set up campsites, house trailers, and a makeshift band office. As of this date, the occupation continues. For its part, the military claims the natives are trespassing, but they've taken no action to have them charged or evicted from the camp. The military and the natives, for the most part, have conducted a peaceful coexistence, with the Department of Defense having to curtail some regular training at the base.
Well, you're right, we can't use the ranges because of the concern for safety. A native could be in the danger area, but as far as any other activity, fieldcraft type of training, survival training in the bush, navigation, patrolling, all of that sort of thing can still go on within the training area.
By late summer, the federal government appointed a special mediator in a bid to bring the issue to some sort of resolution. The natives are insisting, no less, that their land be returned. The military said they've paid for the land several times and that the original occupants and some of their descendants have been well compensated. They have said they would return the land when they had no longer need of it. Little progress has been made.
It was just a question of who do they give it to, when do they give it to, because they're legally obligated to return it.
In August, things heated up somewhat when a military helicopter was fired upon as it flew over the camp. The following day, the Ontario Provincial Police swooped into the camp, searching tents, trailers, and property belonging to the occupants. No weapon was found, and no one has been charged. The occupation continues. Rick Smith, CKCO-TV News.
In November, over 300 deer were shot at Rondeau Park as part of a controlled hunt. The Ministry of Natural Resources says the cull was necessary because the deer herd was out of control and the Rondeau forest was being wiped out through overgrazing. The cull brought together a number of diverse groups whose sole aim was to end the hunt. Todd Lozon takes a look back at the controversy.
They ate all my ground cover a year ago, so I've put this chicken wire around here, you see.
Bill Hallett says if anyone needs evidence of the damage Rondeau deer are causing, his lawn is Exhibit A. He's had to wrap every tree and shrub in wire just to keep the deer out.
All of these tops have been
chewed off, and until I put this
Dick
around,
Coates says he has the same problem. The deer are eating everything in sight. Coates says the herd has grown so large there just isn't enough food for them.
because a number of the deer have been known to starve to death here. They just don't survive the winter.
The Ministry of Natural Resources says the deer herd was threatening the Rondo forest, that because of overgrazing, rare Carolinian plants and trees were in danger of being destroyed. The ministry says the only solution was to close the park and conduct a cull.
And as September, October, and November come along, the county deer are starting to move into Rondo Park.
Throughout the cull, one of the main concerns was that the county deer population would be destroyed. Sportsmen's groups say their research shows Rondo is a winter yarding area for deer from across the southern part of Kent, and that those deer would be wiped out along with animals that are resident in the park year-round.
There won't be enough left of them to sustain a herd for the county. The county yarding deer will be wiped out.
Other sportsmen were angered that the cull was limited to members of Southern Ontario Indian bands. They say the province should have opened the hunt to all sportsmen. Jim Standard says a hunting lottery could have generated revenue.
For the simple fact, say if you put a fee of $100 a license, you have 400 deer, there's $40,000 that the province could see as revenue, and versus it being a total cost to the taxpayers.
It's sensitive for some people. It's sensitive for us too.
Larry Johnson is chief of the Caldwell Band and was in charge of the cull.
The Indian nations of southwestern Ontario can really use the meat. It'll be taken back to the communities and distributed.
By the end of November, the cull was suspended, but not necessarily finished. Ministry officials say that will depend on the outcome of a new count. If the number of deer in the park still exceeds 125, the cull may resume. The ministry hasn't said exactly when the count will be held, and that's a sore point with cull opponents. They say a count should have been held immediately to reveal the true effects of the cull. And they say each day that passes, more county deer will move into the park for winter cover. Near Rondo Park, Todd Lozon, CKCO-TV News.
It was puzzling and troublesome when a parasite began showing up in drinking water in Kitchener and Waterloo, and people started getting sick. And as Bruce Johnston reports, the situation raised questions about how much information the public should be given about health issues.
We don't know what the cause is right now. We haven't been able to identify a particular cause from those cases.
Cryptosporidiosis, an intestinal disorder caused by a parasite, had reared its ugly head in Kitchener and Waterloo. People were experiencing flu-like symptoms. The drinking water was suspect.
The water supply at the Mannheim Treatment Center has been discontinued for use in the Waterloo region since last Thursday.
But the Associate Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Doug Sider, pointed out there was no reason for panic.
We do not recommend that people take extraordinary precautions such as boiling water.
The region shut down the main river water system. They brought in independent water detectives to investigate the problem, and some changes were made in water treatment at Mannheim. 2 months later, the region called a news conference and defended the water treatment system.
The region does not have an inferior water supply in the Mannheim project. The river quality compares very favorably with others, and the water treatment plant is very modern and is of the highest quality.
Regional health officials were also satisfied with the actions taken. The region continues to study the whole issue with the help of outside consultants.
So at this point we have an improved treatment process in place, and we have a much improved monitoring process in place with respect to the surface water in the Grand River.
Jerry Thompson says the region concluded the problem emanated from effluents that end up in the river, for example, agricultural runoff.
There was never any absolute determination that the potable water supply was in fact the source of the cryptosporidiosis, but it was highly suspect.
More than 100 people may have been directly affected by the waterborne parasite. A woman died in June, and when word of her death did not reach the politicians until sometime later, there was political flack over that.
And the more people know and the more they understand about the problem that exists, what we're doing about it, how they should feel about it, how they should react to it. I think the better off everyone is.
In Kitchener, Bruce Johnston, CKCO-TV News.
A story out of London that grabbed national media attention in 1993 came to an abrupt end when the man at the center of it died. 36-year-old Charles Senyonga was accused of knowingly infecting 3 women with HIV, but AIDS-related medical problems took his life before his trial was over. CKCO's Steve Parr reports.
Charles Senyonga entered the national spotlight in 1991 when he became the focus of a precedent-setting prosecution for infecting 3 women with AIDS. The former London shopkeeper was initially charged with 3 counts of aggravated sexual assault, 3 counts of criminal negligence causing bodily harm, and 3 counts of administering a noxious substance. The trial process narrowed that down to criminal negligence causing bodily harm charges. When Senyonga took the stand, he told the court the horrors of war in his native Uganda caused him ongoing anxiety. A psychiatrist testified that Senyonga might have been so traumatized he didn't realize he was a threat to his sex partners. But witnesses testified Senyonga ignored repeated warnings from doctors, nurses, and former sex partners to wear a condom. As the trial continued, Senyonga's physical health became an issue. He began to look weak. Proceedings were sometimes delayed by illness. On July 20th, he died in hospital, 2 weeks before Justice Dougald McDermott was to deliver a verdict. Suddenly, there was a new legal issue. Should a judge deliver a verdict when the accused has died?
As Justice McDermott indicated, well, personally, he would like to give a judgment. He thinks in law, and I believe he's right, that there's really no precedent for it.
The Crown asked for a verdict, and so did one of the complainants, who can't be identified.
I'm going to take this further. It's not okay that someone knowingly infected me, and there's been no justice.
It's more than 5 months after Charles Senyonga's death, and his case still provokes legal controversy. In London, Steve Parr, CKCO-TV News.
In June, 4 workers plunged 40 meters to their death when a scaffold collapsed on the Garden City Skyway in St. Catharines. The scaffold broke loose and flipped over. 6 other workers were left clinging to the underside of the giant bridge. Firefighters rescued them more than an hour later. The Ministry of Labour's probe into the accident won't be wrapped up until later this month or in February. Investigators are still examining different parts of the scaffold. If the Ministry of Labour decides to lay charges, they must do so by this June. Also in November, like a turnip rolling off a truck, a 57-year-old daredevil mechanic took the rocky plunge into the history books. Dave Monday bobbed down the Niagara River in an old diving bell and catapulted over the falls for his 3-second ride to the bottom. Monday lived to tell about his second trip over the falls. A crew on the Maid of the Mist plucked Monday from the Niagara River. And he didn't seem to be too worried about the thousands of dollars in fines that he was facing for performing the stunt. In 1985, Monday took a camera with him on his first trip over the falls. His family says he won't try it again.
Well, instead of saying, "There goes the neighborhood," some Kitchener residents could look out the window last summer and say, "Here comes the neighborhood." In the city's northeast end, 10 families each got a new house and a new start. Rick Gamble explains.
John and Helen Dreyer relaxing at home. Their home. A simple pleasure, but one they never take for granted. With their 3 kids, Kyle, Shannon, and Bianca, John and Helen live in one of 10 bungalows built last summer by Habitat for Humanity. That's a nonprofit international group that constructs affordable housing for those in need. Until they moved in here, the Dryers had been living with relatives. There were 10 people in one house.
To me, this is like a palace. It's mine. We had nothing before, now we got this. You got your privacy back. You got your own way of running your own home again. You got just family life back, just you and your husband and your kids.
And along with privacy comes security and stability. The Dryers have an interest-free loan they have to pay back, but their house is a stake in the future.
If I didn't live here, where would I be now? It's tough to say, but I would say
I don't even want to think about it. I'm just so happy that we're in a position that we're in now.
The Dryers were among 600 volunteers who built 10 houses in 5 days during July. Much of the money and material for the project was donated. Former American President Jimmy Carter was among the workers. This was his 11th build.
You can't really do much about teenage pregnancy or juvenile delinquency or school dropouts or lack of health care without people having a decent place to live.
Volunteers came from all over the continent. The 10 houses are testimony to good work and goodwill.
Habitat has built 100 homes across Canada, and as you can see, the foundation has been laid for future growth. The organization hopes to build next summer on this site right next door to John and Helen, who are already making plans to be part of that labor of love. In Kitchener, Rick Gamble, CKCO-TV News.
In March, an infant in Sarnia who had gained widespread popularity over a life-saving heart transplant returned home. 7-month-old Caitlin Hill returned from a lengthy stay at California's Loma Linda Hospital, where she underwent heart transplant surgery. It was an emotional ordeal for the parents, whose story pulled at the heartstrings of many Sarnia and area residents. A public fundraising effort netted thousands of dollars, money that was used to help care for the baby and family while in California. Baby Caitlin was born with a defective heart valve, which had threatened her life. Last summer, the Hills thanked the community by hosting a huge first birthday party in Sarnia's Canatera Park. To date, Caitlin is doing just fine.
Well, we certainly packed a lot into 1 hour. Of course, we couldn't touch on every story we covered in 1993, but we hope we've reviewed the major ones that affected our viewers in Southern Ontario. I'd like to thank you for joining me this afternoon and wish you, your families and friends the very best in 1994. From everyone here at CKCO-TV, have a happy and prosperous new year.